All right, so for our last video to lecture today, I want to do two things. The first thing that I want to do is talk through Audre Lorde's piece, Poetry is Not a Luxury, which is a beautiful and I think really interesting and engaging piece. And then I want to read through the two poems that I had asked you to read for today, both of which were posted to the New York Times. And so that's going to be our objective. So we're going to talk with Audre Lorde about what poetry does, about what we think about the purpose of a poem as being. And then when we move on to our examples, I'm going to spend the time talking about how we would read these out loud if we were going to potentially perform them. And I'm going to ask you to, in a written reflection, think about how these poems resonate with you in relationship to what Audre Lorde was talking about. And we're going to then, and next time, I'm going to spend a little bit more time trying to interpret these poems, as well as some of the other poems you read for next time in light of Lorde's essay. But I want you to spend the time thinking about how the poems that we read and that I read with you today resonate with or communicate with this Lorde essay, which I do think is quite good. So let's talk about Lorde then. So I wanted to start off by just introducing a frame for this essay, because although the essay is called Poetry is Not a Luxury, there's not a lot of discussion of what it would mean for poetry to be a luxury in the essay. So very briefly, I just wanted to think about this in terms of saying, what is luxury? So luxury is something that we usually think of as being, first of all, something that belongs to the rich, but also something that is ornamental or something that is in excess. So to say that poetry would be a luxury would be, again, to say that it is unnecessary or only is the object of or something that the privileged do. That is what it would mean for poetry to be a luxury. And this comes from the perspective that poetry is mostly about ornament or beautiful language, first of all. So there is a perception then of poems and poetry, of all linguistic embellishment, of speaking poetically in general, as being something that is just decoration, as just excess or luxury. And what Lorde is going to argue in this essay is no, it is in fact not at all luxury or unnecessary or ornamental in that way, because it is actually necessary for us to think about things in politically productive ways. It's necessary for us to think about actually changing the world, she will argue. And the second way in which we can think about this, which is perhaps not what she has in mind, but maybe I think is what she has in mind, but is in any way a profitable connection, is that art and the writing of poetry was for a long time literally a luxury. That is, it is literally something that only the upper classes did, or at least did with any sort of success or notoriety. That artistic production was for the long time, just the province of the upper classes, because you needed leisure time to do it, because you needed time in which you were not working in the factory or on the farms to do the work. Now, of course, we know that the construction of art, that the production of music, that singing songs, all of these things have been done under conditions in which you did not have leisure time, conditions of extreme duress. But at the same time, the perception that, and the reality that largely those who wrote poetry and largely those who were prominent in the poetic fields were those who had a relative privilege. In both of these cases, then, poetry is treated as something that is perhaps frivolous, that is something that is not concrete or attached to real-world concerns. And this is what she wants to pose her argument against. She wants to say that poetry is, in fact, vital. And she thinks about it as vital in a number of different ways. And I have them marked out here as First, poetry as illumination. And here I think it is sufficient just to read her beautiful prose to illustrate this point. She says, "The quality of light by which we live scrutinizes our lives. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing on the product which we live. This is poetry as illumination. For it is through poetry that we give a name to the ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed but already felt." So that is beautiful prose, I think, or a very poetic use of writing to express a point. So another example of sort of performative writing, writing that enacts what it is arguing. But at the same time, I think that it's really important to think about what she's actually trying to communicate here, which is what she's saying is that how we think about the world, the vocabulary through which we think about the world, has a direct bearing on how we live our lives, what we think about as being important, what we notice, what we do. So she thinks about poetry then as an illumination in that it is something that is meant to make us focus on things we wouldn't otherwise have names for, and therefore makes us more perceptive. It makes us scrutinize our lives, as she says, in a way that is, in her argument, is something that can help us in social and political ways imagine new futures, that poetry can illuminate by giving us access to new possibilities, and therefore expressing ways in which we could live our lives that we have not yet discovered. At the same time, though, she says that poetry is access to something ancient and hidden. Access to something ancient and hidden. She says the woman's place of power, and she is writing specifically to Black women here, or addressing them specifically, but she always says the woman and then the human. So she wants this also to be more universal than just to women. She says the woman's place of power within each of us is neither white nor surface. It is dark, it is ancient, and it is deep. So she's talking about this interiority that poetry is supposed to express, this inside of us that poetry is supposed to express. And what she argues here then is that what that is feeling, that European thought, and by that what she means is the rationalism that we've been talking about, that says only logic or ideas matter, that European style of thought that is very dominant in philosophy at the time of her thinking, and in all academic thought, at the most of political thought at the time of her thinking, she says, poses that only ideas can make us free. Only ideas make us free. So in other words, when we want to create political change, she says that what most people think we have to do is generate the new idea that will finally free us, that once that right idea rises to the surface, that we will finally be free. But that, she says, is not what happens. That living is instead what she says is a situation to be experienced and interacted with, a situation to be experienced and interacted with. So she says then that it's not about understanding life as just a series of correct or incorrect or logical or illogical ideas, that it's understanding life as this process, this becoming. And in this way, she agrees with a lot of performance scholars that we've talked about so far, that she wants to replace the idea that life is static and knowable with life as something dynamic that we experience, that we live in, and that changes. And in this context, she says, poetry should be understood as, quote, the revelatory distillation of existence or experience, as opposed to sterile wordplay, or again, ornament, or the luxury of poetry that has it as pure play, pure sterility, only the manipulation of language is what she means here. Is that when we think about poetry as being ornament or being a luxury, we think about it as people playing games with words. But she says that's not what poetry should should be or is. Instead, what poetry is the distillation of an experience into this compressed form that, when read, when encountered, produces a revelation, makes us experience something as a shock. So the idea here then is that poetry actually is this vehicle by which we can communicate experiences in ways that are deeply felt, in ways that are deeply felt. So her argument here then is that European rationality, Western modes of rational thought, have repressed this deep and ancient source of knowledge, which is feeling, and that poetry is about identifying and communicating feelings. So she says then that our examinations of feeling can become the breeding grounds for radical ideas. That poetry and learning how to write poetry is about training ourselves both to accept our repressed feelings, what we've been told not to feel, what we've been told is irrational, and then transposing them into a shared language. And then she says here, I feel so I can be free. So there's a sense then that poetry is about what in the feminist movement we would call consciousness raising, or is it about what in other circumstances we might call building coalitions? It's about expressing feelings and ideas so that they can be shared, so that they can become the ground of a new action, a new combinations of ideas, new experiments. So she says then at the end that are in fact no new ideas, that poetry is not about exposing or expressing some fundamentally new idea that can be communicated as such. It's about putting ideas in new combinations. It's about experimenting with putting ideas together or opposing them to one another. And finally, and most importantly, it is about making ideas felt. It's about making ideas felt. And here is, I think, one of the most important ways that we can understand the performance of poetry and performance in general's function. Is it's about, we've been saying for most of our time so far, that there's a distinction between communication and rationality, saying here is an argument, here is a true fact about the world, and performance and poetry, which is something embodied, which is something dynamic, which is something that suggests or shows rather than simply telling. And here Lorde is saying that what the function of that is to take what we already know, things that are already known in the world, such as, in the context of our project, racism is bad, and to make them so deeply felt that people actually might act on them, that they might create new possibilities around them. So it's about not just the knowledge that is expressed, but it's about creating that audience connection with it. It's about making that knowledge felt. And that is what Lorde is saying is one of the most fundamental functions of poetry, and why poetry is not a luxury, because it is not only what allows us to dream up new combinations of ideas and dream up new ways of living in the world, or ways of living and enact those ways of living in the world that we have dreamed before, but she says this is in fact the only way, or one of the only mechanisms through which we can really communicate fundamental shared truths that are repressed inside of us, things that we know and feel are true about our social world and the world that we live in, and make those things intelligible to others so that we may in fact act on them, so that we may find something in common and build a political future with them. So for her then, the function of poetry is fundamentally political. It is about both the revelation, the moment of shock, where you bring these elements together and people see them in a new light, and it hits them, that force, which is then that emotional relationship that it creates, that experience of feeling the knowledge as opposed to just knowing the knowledge. That, she says, is the function of poetry and the function of performance. So that's all we're going to say about Lorde for now. I would love to hear your feedback on what you thought about her essay in your forums posts. And again, I'm going to ask you to do a writing exercise that hits on these concepts again. But so remember remember, though, that this is how we want to think about poetry in Lord's view. We want to think about it as illumination. We want to think about it as revelation. We want to think about it as an expression of repressed feeling. And we want to think about it as a communication that allows what we know and what we think to be felt and acted on. That is the function of poetry, is to move us to action by using language to make us feel instead of using language simply to make us think. So, from there, then, we're going to move on to read a couple of poems. And I'm just going to make a couple of notes as I read them to you about the way you should think about poetic structure as informing how you would read something out loud if you were going to perform it. And then on Monday, we're going to get a lot more into detail about the performance of poetry and the interpretation of poetic performance and its relationship to race and politics. I want to say before I begin reading these poems, before I begin reading these two poems that on the website where you were reading them, there are recordings of the authors themselves reading them, or at least that's true about the Jericho Brown poem. So we might read them a little bit differently, and of course you should listen to the authors read them. Jericho Brown has a much nicer reading voice than I do, and obviously he wrote his poems, so he is more connected to it. But I'm going to read them just so we can get a sense of how we would go about thinking about the line breaks in the poem, how we would go about measuring what we say based on what is written on the page, because so much of thinking about performing poetry is thinking about this process of translation. So people, first of all, take a lot of liberties and do a lot of artistic experimentation in terms of punctuation and grammar in poems, and people will capitalize the first word on every line sometimes, and people will not other times. So there are obviously variations, and sometimes you'll read a very experimental poem that is probably just meant for the page and can't even really be read out loud. But anything that you're going to be interpreting into a performance, you'll have to read out loud. And in more straightforward or conventional poetry, which isn't to say there's anything wrong with it, just in more traditionally structured poetry, there are a few rules of thumb that can help us with this process. So I just like to think about it in terms of beats, and this is, again, just a rule of thumb. There is no strict rule on this, but I think about one beat, so a full beat pause, as applying to periods and stanza breaks. Periods and stanza breaks. And so a stanza then is whenever there is a line break or the paragraph break between different sections of the poem. So in Say Thank You, I'm Sorry, the Jericho Brown poem, there are not stanza breaks from what I can tell, or the stanza breaks are where the advertisements are. But in a stanza break, you would pause, typically. And I like to pause in a stanza break for about as long as you would pause for a period, which is close to a full beat. At line breaks and commas, I like to pause for so on line breaks and commas, I like to pause for about a third of that amount of time. So about a third of a beat. And then for colons, semicolons, and dashes, I like to pause for about a half of a beat. So those are a little bit more emphasized than commas and line breaks, where you're barely pause at all, and a little bit less emphasized than stanza breaks or periods, where you do want to take a relatively full pause. So that is all I really want to run us through today when we're reading these poems. And I want you to practice at home reading them yourself as well. So listen to me read them, try reading it yourself, and then listen to the recording and see how they compare, and think about what types of performance choices you might make. When we think about beat poetry, or not beat poetry, but rather spoken word poetry, poetry that is written to be performed, you'll find a lot more of the sort of of structure devices that you find in written poetry. So things like repetition and rhyming, those things you'll see a lot more in spoken word poetry. And sometimes spoken word poetry gets pretty close to being hip hop. And sometimes spoken word poetry isn't like that at all. It's much more narrative. So there's a great deal of diversity in what was traditionally performed poetry as well. But all poetry is read at some point for the most part, except for, again, the stuff that can only exist on the page that is really experimental. Most poetry is read at poetry readings, is read with the human voice, is written with the human voice reading it in mind. So it has this inherently sort of performative dimension to it. So in addition to everything that I just mentioned, then, what you want to be paying attention to is moments in which there is, so rhyming, if that happens or if that exists, if there is assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds, if there's consonance, which is the repetition of consonant sounds, if there is parallelism, which is again repetition, all of these things are things that we should be paying attention to because they tell us what the rhythm of the poem is. So that's my sort of intro, and now I'm just going to read these poems to you. And then at the end, again, I'm going to ask you to respond. All right. So this is me reading then Jericho Brown's Thank You, I Am Sorry, or Say Thank You, I'm Sorry. Jericho Brown won the Pulitzer Prize this year for his book of poems, The Tradition, which is an amazing book of poetry on race and politics, and something that I would highly recommend. Both of the poems we're reading today, though, are poems that the New York Times asked prominent poets to write about our current political or existential situation. So let me just take a sip of coffee and then we'll get started. Say thank you, say I'm sorry. I don't know whose side you're on, but I am here for the people who work in grocery stores that glow in the morning and close down for deep cleaning at night, right up the street, and in cities I mispronounce, in towns too tiny for my big black car to quit, and in every wide corner of Kansas where going to school means at least one field trip to a slaughterhouse. I want so little. Another leather-bound book, a gimlet with a lavender gin, bread so good when I taste it, I can tell you how it's made. I'd like us to rethink what it is to be a nation. I'm in a mood about America today. I have PTSD about the Lord. God save the people who work in grocery stores. They know a bit of glamour is a lot of glamour. They know how much it costs for the eldest of us to eat. Save my loves and not my sentences. Before I see them, I draw a mole near my left dimple, add a flare to the smile they can't see. Behind my mask, I grin, or lie, or maybe I wear the mouth of a beast. I eat wild animals, while some of us grow up knowing what gnocchi is. The people who work at the grocery store don't care. They say, thank you. They say, sorry, we don't sell motor oil anymore, with a grief so thick you could touch it. Go on, touch it. It is early, it is late. They have washed their hands. They have washed their hands for you, and they take the bus home. So that is that poem, which I think is really quite incredible. So just notice about the way that I was reading it, hopefully you were following along with me while I did, that I was taking very small pauses, almost just to emphasize the next word on line breaks. Commas about the same, although a little bit more, but I think about those as being about the same, about a third of a beat, a little pause for enunciation or for emphasis. Then for colons and semicolons and dashes, I was pausing a little bit longer, about a half of a beat. And that, again, is when somebody uses one of those, it's really supposed to make a point. So in that circumstances, I was pausing for a little bit longer because it's supposed to set up, and then you're really emphasizing something. So pausing on the colons. And then finally, for, as I said, there aren't stanza breaks here, but for periods, pausing longer. And you'll notice when you read this, and this is really important, that at the first, like until the very last third of the poem, there aren't very many periods at all. There are only a couple of places where you come to a full stop. But when you get to the end of the poem, there are a lot more periods. There are a lot more stops, and that slows down your pace if you are attending to it. So when you're reading the poem, then, that's what you want to do. You want to lean into the way that it's written to try to be perceptive of how its language is guiding you to read it. So I listened to the Jericho Brown recording, and there are slight differences, but at the same time, our enunciation is mostly similar in terms of how we rhythmically divide things, because that is the way the poem is written, because the grammar of the poem prompts you to read it that way. It prompts you to read it that way. So the next poem that I want to read then is by Claudia Rankine. I believe that that is how you pronounce her last name. I guess it could be Rankine. I haven't heard it said out loud, so my apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Again, this poem is recorded, or there's a recording of her reading this poem that is attached to this. So please please do listen to me read it yourself, and then listen to the recording and see how that changes things. In this case, again, we have a poem without stanza breaks. So just remember, when we read poems with stanza breaks, usually you would pause as long as you were for periods. This one also has a couple of more conventions in it that we might want to take note of. So in this poem, there are italics that are used to communicate that somebody else is speaking in the place of quotation marks. Sometimes you will see that, and in that way you can think about voicing. That is, there is somebody else speaking here who's not the actual narrator of the poem. So while you may not want to do an impression of somebody else speaking, varying your pitch there is going to be important, or varying your emphasis there is going to be important to communicate that it has, that somebody else is indeed speaking. And that's not what italics always do. Sometimes they're used for emphasis, but in this case, that is what they seem to do. And I would, and they also in many other poems are used in that same way. And then the only other thing that's different here is the use of question marks, which is something we also often see in poems quite frequently. And this again gives it a more conversational sort of effect, where there's a discourse that is sort of going on. So let's engage with this one then. Again, it is called Weather. And so one last thing though before we actually get started on this. So for poetry, sometimes you will see that the first line of a poem moves directly into the text of the poem itself. And in that case, you might read it more continuously. In some cases, the poem's title is standalone. So in this case, it is standalone. So I would stop for the length of a period or a stanza break before I commence reading. But in other circumstances, if it does run directly in, you might not want to, but you'll still want to emphasize the title. So you would read it as if you would read the title, pause for like a half a beat, and then jump into the text, but for perhaps less time than you would, when the title is standalone. So here is Weather. On a scrap of paper in the archive is written, "I have forgotten my umbrella." Turns out, in a pandemic, everyone, not just the philosopher, is without. We scramble in the drought of information held back by inside traders. Drop by drop. Face covering? No, yes. Social distancing? 6 feet under for underlying conditions. Black, just us and the blues kneeling on a neck with the full weight of a man in blue. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. In extremis, I can't breathe, gives way to asphyxiation, to giving up this world, and then, Mama, called to, a call to protest. Fire, glass, say their names, say their names. White silence equals white violence, the violence of again. A militarized police force tear gassing, bullets ricochet, and civil unrest taking it, burning it down. Whatever contracts keep us social compel us now to disorder the disorder. Peace. We're out to repair the future. There's an umbrella by the door, not for yesterday, but for the weather that's here. I say weather, but I mean a form of governing that deals out death and names it living. I say weather, but I mean a November that won't be held off. This time, nothing, no one forgotten. We are here for the storm that is storming, because what's taken matters. So, again, I think that that is a really excellent and provocative poem, and I hope that you agree. So, what I want you to do then is, as I said, I want you to take a moment, and hopefully you've been doing this along with me, but if you haven't, I want you to listen to me read, which you have. Then I want you to give it a try yourself. So, if you haven't done that yet, give the reading a try yourself, and then go back in and listen to the other authors read it. And I want you to pay attention to how each one of us, me, you, and the author who reads it, parses the writing differently, but really focus in on how the poem invites you to read it. So in the one that we just went through, for instance, in the opposite way of the Jericho Brown piece, periods go away. Toward the end of the poem. There is a bunch of commas between different descriptions of actions and events that are happening in chaos, and you get the sense, because of that movement, of the anxiety, of the, again, chaos or the anarchy that is felt, of the sense of nerves, of the sense of something to come from that rushing. And then, again, it hits then slowly onto periods again at the end to take us back into something slower to conclude, to take us from that moment of climax back down. So we have this pacing, this intensity that's written into the language of the poem. And that's what we really want to try to be sensitive to. So after you are done then with your own reading, what I want you to do is just take 5 minutes and spend some time thinking about how these poems correspond with, in our discussion of Audre Lorde's piece, what she identifies as being important in poetry. In what way do you feel as if these poems are communicating feeling? In what ways do you think that they are attaching feeling to thought to make it felt? In what ways do these poems feel like revelations, like illuminations, like unearthing something deep, like expressing something that is deeply felt but has been repressed? So think about those sorts of ideas. In what way do you feel like these poems communicate or put together old ideas to create new possibilities, to make us think critically and to think critically about the future? So that's your free writing exercise today, which you are welcome to use as your attendance. And what I want you to do to wrap up this session is just think about these things. And please feel free to use these as the material for your forums posts next week, because I would really like to hear what your thoughts are in terms of the interpretation of these poems and how they might reflect things that Lorde discusses. So that's all I got for today. So thank you so much for your attention, and I will talk to you on Monday. Have a great one. Bye.